Hey everyone, I'm Tony Battaji and welcome to the Stronger with Time podcast, where we explore what it takes for women to train, perform, and feel at their best across all phases of life. In today's episode, I speak with Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple. Dr. Colenso-Semple is a muscle physiology researcher and science communicator with a special focus on female health and fitness. Lauren earned her PhD in integrated physiology from McMaster University in Canada and has a master's degree in exercise science from the University of South Florida. Dr. Colenso-Semple's most recent work explored the influence of ovarian hormones on exercise-induced adaptations across the menstrual cycle. Lauren is also an expert fitness professional with many years of practical experience in strength and conditioning and sports nutrition, and she is a co-owner of the Mass Research Review. Today's episode is essential for anyone who has been confused by the incredible amount of opinions that exist around women's health and fitness advice. We cover cycle syncing and whether or not females need to alter their training in accordance with the rise and fall of the ovarian hormones across the cycle. We discuss protein needs and timing, resistance training responses, and whether the sex differences mean that females require different training and nutrition recommendations to males. This episode was full of such practical take-home information for females. So without further delay, please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Lauren Colenso-Semple. Lauren, so great to have you with me today.
Thank you for having me.
We've been speaking on and off for a while now, and I've obviously been an avid watcher and reader of your research because you have come into a space where there was a real gap in our understanding, especially around the menstrual cycle, and you've provided answers that we can use as coaches. So let's start with your research, because when I went to university in the 90s and we would look at sports science studies and training interventions, they were in the large place done on men. And when there were women, they were often just acute. So it would just be a day study. And the reason for this primarily was, in the 1990s, there were more sports science students who were men because the coaching jobs were primarily for men. But there was also this thing called the menstrual cycle, that there was a huge gap in our understanding. Would these hormonal fluctuations change performance and therefore skew the results? So it was just easier to not have women in the studies. So most of them were from men. And you have come along and addressed this information. So let's start with let's take a step back, and I'm going to get you to mansplain for all the men in the audience. What is going on hormonally in the menstrual cycle for a female?
So I agree, and that really prompted my interest in this area. And to step back further, my interest in exercise science, resistance training research, muscle physiology really stemmed from being a fitness professional, wanting the best results for myself, my clients at the time. And I learned that this was one of the big reasons and fears. And to this day, if you try to publish, you always get the question, did you quote unquote control for the menstrual cycle? So it's a very interesting question, but one that is quite difficult to study. We often talk about the menstrual cycle as a 28-day cycle. That's not necessarily the case for most people. The cycle can be as short as 21 days, as long as 37 days. Anywhere in there is considered quote unquote normal. But briefly, when you start your menstrual period, that's the beginning of the menstrual cycle. And the hormones, estradiol, progesterone, luteinizing hormone, they're all low at the beginning of the cycle. And then estradiol increases and peaks prior to ovulation. Ovulation is defined as the spike in luteinizing hormone, and that divides the phases. So we have the follicular phase and the luteal phase. Follicular phase, low hormones early on, and then high estradiol. Post-ovulation, we have the luteal phase, which is defined by an increase in progesterone, which peaks mid-phase, and a secondary peak in estradiol. So if we look at the mid-luteal phase, it's high progesterone, moderately high estradiol, and then both hormones decline and the cycle starts again. So that's a snapshot of those hormonal changes we would anticipate to see in an individual with a menstrual cycle.
Fascinating. And I think for all men who understand that there are hormonal fluctuations and might experience that with their friends or sisters, personality changes that can sometimes go on. I think this understanding, so when we hear it's hormonal, now we understand what those hormones are actually doing across. But I think what I found, again, as a male, really interesting is that we all thought it's a month, it's 28 days, but such a wide variation. One would imagine it makes it extremely difficult to control for that in research unless you're actually measuring these hormones. So I'm assuming in many early studies, they just guess it. And in your studies, you measure these different changes.
That's right. So anyone who's tried to dive into this literature on, frankly, any topic, you'll probably see that it's criticized and people will refer to low quality methodologies. And that is for the reason you just stated. People assume, well, hey, an average cycle is 28 days. And on average, if you have a 28-day cycle, then ovulation is right in the middle. And those two phases we talked about are equal length. So we can just make conclusions about cycle phase or hormone profiles based on all of those assumptions instead of actually tracking cycles, measuring ovulation, and measuring blood hormones.
And this new data that you have come up with and been part of the change in thinking, the whole gap before where there just wasn't high quality research has opened up a whole area for many authors to start having unfounded claims about if your hormones are doing this, then your fuel utilization will be different across the cycle or your strength will be different across the cycle. So could you please explain what's happening from a fuel utilization perspective across the cycle, the proposed fuel utilization?
Based on the, again, low quality evidence, right, looking at things like metabolism, it has been proposed that these hormones would affect how you are utilizing carbohydrates or fats, and therefore you should be adjusting your nutrition accordingly. It's also been proposed that the higher estradiol is somehow anabolic or better for strength training, either exercise performance or exercise-induced adaptations like muscle growth and strength. And that conversely, the high progesterone is somehow catabolic or bad for those adaptations. And so if you see these popular cycle syncing type programs, they will often suggest decreasing the intensity or even not lifting weights at all during that phase.
And this is what's so remarkable to me as a coach, that there is this idea that your fuel utilization changes. So you should maybe eat more carbohydrates at this phase and then less at others. Or when progesterone is so high that we should really hold back on going for PRs and having high volume training. Was this information derived from human studies, or where do we understand the role of estrogen and progesterone in fuel utilization or in muscle adaptations?
Frankly, we know very little about the specific role of these hormones when it comes to muscle, but we do have some rodent model data to look to, and those rodent models basically show that if you remove the ovaries from a rodent, which shuts down all hormone production, they have difficulty maintaining muscle mass. And that sort of fuels the hypothesis that, oh, perhaps there is something anabolic about these hormones. But that's a very overly simplistic interpretation, because when you shut down hormone production, that's not what we would say physiologic in humans. Even when you're going through the menopause transition, hormones are constantly fluctuating and then slowly decline. It's not this on-off switch that you get with this model of removing the ovaries from the rodent. But that is really where this stems from, that somehow the absence of these hormones appears to be problematic for muscle maintenance in this rodent model.
And the rodent model has been used quite a bit as a theory and mechanism for, if the hormones are doing this, then this is the food you should be eating or the training you should be doing. And this isn't my area, but an area where I feel it's also been similarly misunderstood is where there's these textbook understandings or molecular signaling pathways. And you look at them in the cell and there's this conflict. And I'm thinking what most people understand is if you do aerobic training and resistance training in the same week, then molecularly we see this blunting. But when you look at training studies, and these training studies have also been done in women specifically, there isn't such a blunting. And in most instances, the incorporation of aerobic training improves your resistance training outcomes. So this is a classic instance. If we rely on textbook understanding without training interventions, we are at a serious ability to make mistakes and give incorrect advice.
I think it's important to acknowledge that the people who are doing these molecular signaling type studies or rodent model interventions are not concluding or intending to promote anything when it comes to human nutrition or training programs. The reason these models are cool and interesting is because you can overexpress a gene or delete a gene or subject the rodent to what would be a totally unethical training model. But that allows scientists to identify particular mechanisms or exclude particular mechanisms that can be a really valuable hypothesis generator for the human trials. But we have to do the human trials in order to confirm that whatever you saw in the rodent model, which is a much simpler model, is actually going to translate to humans, which is a much more complex and dynamic model.
And I think this is the key point. And because we both are coaches as well as having a foot in the science, is that it is really interesting to look at gene expression and different cell signaling pathways that are gender specific. And I think that's beyond controversy. We know that this is the case. But in actual training studies where males and females are given identical protocols, we see very similar adaptations to the point that you really can't conclude that what's happening via signaling or hormonal pathway is actually doing anything different to your results in the real world. Is that something you would agree with?
I would. I like to say there's a difference between something that's scientifically or mechanistically interesting and something that is actionable or practically relevant when we're talking about people lifting or coaches training others. And it's very important to distinguish between the two because frankly, some studies are simply not designed to inform training recommendations. And that's fine, but we can't then look to those and cite those in creating training recommendations. We have to actually have the human subject data and the longer term human subject data because we see this time and time again. Your example of concurrent training or the interference effect is a great one because what was identified as this potentially interesting mechanism over basically 2 decades of research, we concluded it's probably not that big of a deal unless you're performing crazy high volumes of training. We see the same thing with acute versus long-term, this idea that, you're oxidizing more fat during this session acutely. Would that mean you're losing more fat over time if you do that type of training? And once we actually do the long-term studies, what we realize is no. But again, it's a valid hypothesis to observe this acutely and then think, hey, maybe there's something here. And that's where you get the fat burning zone on your treadmill at the gym.
Right. And I can remember this being drawn to my attention over 10 years ago. I had John Hawley and Louise Burke, husband and wife, speak for the fitness industry, and I arranged a conference. And John, who is a molecular researcher, would be speaking about these pathways of cell signaling that occur with different modes of exercise. And then his wife, who is a renowned applied scientist, would say, to me, that's just all alphabet soup. Let's just have a look at, let's put males and females in the intervention and do the 3-4 week study. And I think they must have very interesting conversations around the dinner table at night.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. Because when it comes to real people training, they also don't have that data on themselves. So we need to look at relevant outcomes that they can measure. So talking about things like fiber type or even grams of lean mass for certain circumstances, they don't have access to that. So let's not try to provide recommendations that aren't practically actionable and that you can't even track over time.
Let's keep talking about training and turn our attention to endurance training. I do endurance training myself. I've been a coach up to Olympic level of endurance athletes for 30 years. And we would use, and when I say we, the collective coaches, a combination of different intensity zones at different phases of the training year to do different things. But there is good data, especially coming out of Norway, to show that the greater your aerobic fitness base, the better you can tolerate high intensity work. So it was really surprising to me, as both a coach and a scientist, that recommendations have been made that females specifically, because of fiber type, different protein pathways of lactate and mitochondrial adaptation that have been seen in isolated studies, women should be doing more high intensity work and less low intensity work. And when I went to look at the studies that these claims have been made on, they were actually based on rodent studies, both on mitochondrial content in the liver and transporters in the liver of mice. Mm-hmm. This is an alarming place we find ourselves in the industry, because even the quotes from the direct paper leave out in mice. At the end, there's a quote that will say, females have less X, Y, and Z, transporters of lactate. And then they put the end of quote. And then the next line in the paper said, in mice. How often do you see recommendations for females actually coming from a data set found in rodents when we actually have human studies in females?
Unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of that. And it's one thing to transparently discuss rodent research.
Right.
But if you don't disclose that the study was done in rodents, then you're really misleading people because of all the reasons that we discussed. Rodent metabolism, rodent reproductive cycles, vastly different than humans. And so not knocking the rodent models, not knocking those scientists, it's important science, but it's not designed to tell us how to train or how to eat. And we see time and time again that the hypotheses generated from those models don't actually pan out when we test them in humans. The other thing that I continue to see is what is basically a kernel of truth extrapolated from an unhealthy individual. So, for example, claims about cortisol, acute increases in cortisol. People are taking truths from people with chronically high elevated cortisol levels, meaning they have a health condition. And the chronically high elevated cortisol is a symptom of that health condition. And maybe they are having issues with body composition. And that is being used as a sort of fear mongering around high intensity exercise or fasting and telling people that, oh, you're going to gain body fat, lose muscle mass, or wreak havoc on your hormones.
And I think that is a very popular message, that you shouldn't do X, Y, and Z, or you should eat this and that to prevent these spikes in cortisol. And I can remember in the late 90s, I had a French-Canadian mentor, and I flew over to where he was in America, and he was only do this and never do that, because that will spike your cortisol. And he was one of the big proponents of the cortisol theory. The Olympic Committee just published a book on endocrinology in sport and exercise by Kramer and his colleagues. And I went through all of the cortisol sections, and maybe I was sick that day at university, but I didn't really understand the endocrinology of exercise. But cortisol goes sky high every time we exercise for numerous reasons, other than it being a stress. It's promoting fuel. But it's this idea that we need to avoid any blip in cortisol. And maybe we're just missing the idea that there's chronic cortisol and there's medical conditions of elevations in cortisol. And then there's the normal fluctuation that goes up and down with these hormones. We'll come back to cortisol because let's revisit it with fasted state training. But with these fluctuations of hormones, and you look at what cortisol or testosterone is doing with exercise, it goes up and then it goes down. And one of your colleagues, Stu Phillips, was really the first to present an alternative viewpoint to Kramer and others, that the increase and decrease or the change is not enough to be doing things to skeletal muscle. So something else must be going on. And you have actually measured these hormones across the menstrual cycle. So why don't we come back and finish off the menstrual discussion? What did you do and what did you find with hormones and performance? Because I think around your time, endurance studies in another lab looked at endurance performance across the cycle and didn't find any differences. And then you came in from a more muscle perspective. So why don't you tell us what you did, what you found?
So importantly, I tracked the cycles for months and tracked ovulation, meaning measuring that you're actually having that spike in luteinizing hormone, and then also took blood to measure hormones across the cycle because interestingly, although we have this picture in our mind that I described at the beginning of the discussion about when and how much these hormones fluctuate, when you measure them in real people, the timing and the magnitude of those fluctuations is really variable. So we did that and then looked at the muscle protein synthesis response to a week of resistance training, either in that high estradiol late luteal phase or in the high estradiol late follicular phase compared to the high progesterone mid luteal phase in a within person design, meaning everybody went through both conditions and we took muscle biopsies and used metabolic tracers to actually look at that rate of incorporation. And as anticipated, resistance training increased muscle protein synthesis, but there were no phase-based differences. So this is really good data to tell us that the muscle adaptations we can expect to see in one phase or another, or your ability to build muscle in one phase or another, there's no difference here. We shouldn't be saying, hey, back off the intensity, do some yoga and light stretching. You shouldn't be lifting weights. Totally the wrong message. It's not supported by the evidence.
And how has that, I mean, that's for anyone who's not familiar with science can get that you went to extreme levels to measure these things. That's not easy and it's really expensive. And this now message has changed that gap where there was a gap in understanding and people have jumped onto it, eat differently, train differently according to hormones. How has that message been received now that this data is out there, it's been published and it's been pretty well promoted?
Mixed reviews.
Right.
I think some people felt like they were seen and heard and it was empowering for women to be told that you should be training differently around the cycle. But I don't know a single legitimate coach who would ever prescribe this type of training program, because to say, hey, you have strength and hypertrophy goals, but we're only going to lift weights for 1 or 2 weeks out of the month, you just never do it. There's not a single circumstance in which that would make sense. It's going to hinder your adaptations. We need to train consistently. We need to give stimulus appropriately to the muscle in order to grow. And we need to practice those lifts if we want to improve strength performance. That means you have to do it regularly.
Right. And I think that's the take-home message, is that consistency over the months, over the years, is what creates the change that we're looking for, whether it's bone or muscle or fitness. So we can't have a stochastic on-off based on proposed hormones that you've shown have no effect. So endurance performance is unaffected, physical performance is unaffected, muscle adaptation is unaffected. What about fuel utilization? And using more carbohydrates at specific phases of the month. In sports science, there's a very famous saying that is, you fuel according to the demands of training. But I've never seen the top sports dietitian say fuel according to the hormone fluctuations in a menstrual cycle. Now, that's not to be facetious, but who's looking at this and what's been found?
I think some of the questions and claims around this are coming back to this proposed idea that, again, evidence doesn't support it. But to say you are better suited for performance or for adaptations in one phase or another, and therefore we should be fueling differently. But it's also really important to highlight that these hormone fluctuations are taking place over a few days here and there, and our system doesn't see each training session and each meal as the end all be all to how we will perform in the subsequent training session or how the muscle will respond. For example, when we assess the response to training, that response isn't just in that session and an hour afterwards. That response continues over the subsequent day, maybe 2 days, depending on what we did. And so I know we like to talk about things like protein intake or carbohydrate intake in a 24-hour period. But we really only do that because it's a convenient way for us to frame it and for people to apply it. It's not like the body resets every 24 hours and then all of a sudden, because there has been one shift in hormones, that then you would need to do everything differently. It's just a misunderstanding of how physiology works and how nutrition affects it.
Right. That's a great answer. And I think that last line, there's a misunderstanding. And I think this is really across the board, whether we look at muscle adaptation between genders, fuel usage. It's often a misunderstanding or a really simplistic understanding that, oh, this happens in theory, so you should do this differently, despite having pretty overwhelming science that is not quite correct. One other thing that I read recently in a book about gender-specific training was that the pill can blunt training adaptations. This is something you've done some work in. And again, as a male, we have no idea about this stuff. So tell us what you have found with the contraceptive pill and training adaptations.
So it's important to note that when you introduce a hormonal contraceptive, you're suppressing all of those hormone fluctuations that we just talked about. So to that point, I say someone who's on an oral contraceptive pill actually doesn't have a menstrual cycle. And I think that's also a misunderstanding that's out there, because there are people who are on the birth control pill who are adopting these cycle syncing programs and they don't even have a menstrual cycle. That said, there are mixed results when we look at the data comparing people who are on and off the pill, but whether it looks to be favorable or detrimental, the effect is so small in either direction. There's a great meta-analysis from Kirstie Elliott-Sales' lab looking at this, and a newer one from one of her students looking specifically at a muscle hypertrophy, strength, and power. And when we look at the literature as a whole, there really does not seem to be an effect either way of the oral contraceptive pill.
Okay, fantastic. Great to know. And again, for all the men out there who've been wondering, or when they do see women who are on the contraceptive pill have potentially greater increases in strength and muscle mass, you go and look at those numbers like, I wouldn't be too excited about those numbers. And what I know you've collaborated with Kirstie Elliott-Sales, and what a great contribution you guys are making to this female space, because we hear there are no studies in men. You literally hear this quote. And yes, there's underrepresentation, but thanks to people like Kirstie and Louise Burke, Kate Ackerman, and yourself, we're seeing this such wonderful resurgence in very female specific. So that's kudos to you all. You've done work in muscle fiber typing. This is something that I find super interesting, but almost as a coach, knowing one's fiber type is almost practically irrelevant. And there might be some exceptions to that. There's some really interesting work coming out of Belgium from Wim de Vries' lab looking at recovery time between fiber types, ways of measuring this and seeing whether there is a practical application. But by and large, I think it's been underwhelming to even know what your muscle fiber type is, between muscle groups, between individuals. You're never going to know, but you hear claims. And I think there's a direct quote from a book that I just read, which was men have the lion's share of fast twitch fibers, the lion's share of muscle fibers, fast twitch in men. And I read something like this and I think, how on earth do you know this? These samples are taken from one isolated muscle and applied to the entire body. So you've done work on this, but here is another case where there is an understanding that females generally have more slow twitch than fast twitch. Therefore, women should lift heavy shit, is what the quote is. You should lift heavy stuff because you've got slow twitch fibers. Now, I look at that and I think you either don't understand how muscle fibers are recruited during weight training, or you again are trying to create a very specific niche that's not at all based in realities. Tell us the work you've done in fiber types, and is there any practical relevance to females lifting weights? Do they need to lift a specific rep range because they've got slow twitch muscle fibers?
When you're actually measuring fiber type distribution, to your point, we take maybe 50 grams of muscle and then you put it under a microscope and then you tease the fibers apart with tweezers. So they almost look like tiny little hairs. And then we take a sample of that sample and measure myosin heavy chain content to then say, here's the proportion of one type or the other. That to say, we're taking a very small amount of muscle, think like the size of a pencil eraser or less, and then we're teasing out a few fibers from that, and then we're typing based on that. What we do see is training changes fiber type. So if you measure an elite marathon runner or an elite Olympic weightlifter, their fiber type distribution will look different because they are training a very specific way for performance. I don't see the utility in going the other direction and saying, I need to be doing some type of training based on my perception of what my fiber type distribution might be. We're getting so far into the weeds here. If you want to facilitate a certain performance adaptation, whether that's endurance specific or strength specific, then you need to engage in that activity on an appropriate basis and apply all of the intelligent training block approaches that we know. And we don't need to be concerned about what the muscle fiber adaptations are going to be, because that's not something that people can measure, nor should they need to.
Right.
The idea that women should be training a specific way to then try to adjust that fiber type distribution and then therefore their health outcomes will be better, it's too many leaps.
Too many leaps. I agree completely. And I think where there are differences, real differences in muscle fiber typing, and again, this is the work from Belgium, is that if you have a lot of fast twitch fibers and you require more recovery time, a coach would know this because you would be under recovered when you come to that next training session. So rather than, because you are fast twitch, you're only going to train weights on Monday and Thursday because you need, this becomes really silly that we're trying to take mechanisms and scientific principles and apply them into the weights room and into the gym. I just don't think it can be done. And I don't know any coaches who would do this.
No, having measured these fiber type distributions in these elite athletes, you actually don't end up seeing sex differences at that level, which is another indication that it's the training that you're doing. It's not inherent biological sex. So I think we're just missing the mark here to even be having this conversation in the same breath as, and therefore you should do 5 reps.
If you're looking for a structured roadmap to apply these insights, we've created a 9-week course that bridges research and real-world training. The link is in the show notes. In the 90s, I had a mentor, and I had a lot of mentors in the 1990s, and one of them was very famous for saying, train Tarzan, not Jane, and the other way around. In other words, that males and females are 2 different species and therefore require different volumes, loads, training, different endurance. This was a really he was a foundational thinker in gender differences. And now remember, back in the 90s, we didn't know any of this stuff. So you could be forgiven in thinking, okay, well, yeah, you look different, you got different hormones, so let's do different things. Now, fast forward 30 years, we now have training studies, we've got direct comparisons, and we've got meta-analyses. Your reading of the literature and muscle fiber typing and hormonal difference, do males and females really have a different response when it comes to, say, muscle hypertrophy? So we want to grow muscle as we age. Is there a marked differences in how a male and female respond to resistance training?
The more data on this that comes out, the more we see on a relative basis, men and women adapt really similarly. So the starting point will be different, and that's because of the surge in testosterone during puberty. So an adult untrained man will have more muscle and more strength than an adult untrained woman. But once they both start engaging in challenging progressive resistance training on a relative basis, so if we think about it as a percentage of their starting point, the gains are extremely similar. So this is a real indication that we don't need to be doing things very differently. The same principles apply to both sexes.
And a recent review, a meta-analysis from Martin Ruffalo and his colleagues showed that there really is no difference at all. So that would really throw a lot of cold water on the idea of gender-specific resistance training, which I know you and I are asked an awful lot about. But I am a female, I'm perimenopause, I'm postmenopause, therefore I should be doing this and that based on hormonal changes. And ultimately, that's what it's going to come down to. There are hormonal shifts and there are muscle fiber differences. But if I understand what you're saying and what the totality of the research is indicating, is that this doesn't actually change the training outcomes.
That's right. And I also think those two things you just proposed are just looking at the wrong thing, because what we see is that the training is what's making the difference. And these acute hormonal shifts or potential fiber type differences aren't meaningful when we actually look at those adaptations to training. And a lot of this information has people focused on things that are really unimportant, but are then affecting how they are approaching their fitness, which either through poor advice or unsustainable programming or just utter confusion can really lead people astray.
And I think that's at the heart of the message, is that these training protocols are often just unsustainable. And the ones that I can think about, and I see as a coach a lot, is this, again, back to aerobic training, that you shouldn't do the moderate intensities because as a female, you don't respond well. We've got studies to show that that is simply not true. But the argument is that females should therefore do sprinting and high intensity interval training over that low intensity work. So it's not that you never do low intensity, but your lion's share should be in this direction. But firstly, it's a misunderstanding of the science. When you, again, open the hood, you look at the data and they're comparing sprint training to moderate intensity over 3 weeks. Of course, we're going to see a change. Where we see that disappear is when that study is extended beyond 3 weeks. So in other words, what gives you a very fast boost in performance then plateaus really quickly. So individuals are taking the results of a 3-week study and then applying it to the life of an individual. And this is where we see injuries. They're not prepared for it. They just, by all means, sprint, but don't do it exclusively, and prepare your body for it.
And from the coaching perspective, most people do not know how to run properly. And so just to put that blanket message out there, not only that everyone should be running, but sprinting. I mean, sprint mechanics are specific and important if you are going to be able to do it safely and over the long term. And I don't know that many people who are super open to doing any type of exercise long term based on what the science says or what I say or anything, right? So to not take that into account is so short-sighted, because if I tell my 70-year-old mom, hey, you need to lift 5x5 deadlifts and do sprint intervals, she's not doing it. Right. So that's another message that's really missed here. It's not just the fact that it's not important or meaningful to do it this way versus that way. It's also giving people advice that they simply won't adopt.
Right. And this is where we need the input of coaches who, if the ultimate goal is to lift 5 sets of 5 and to do sprints, great. How long will it take to prepare your shock absorbing tendons and your bone to absorb those loads? Well, it's going to be over a year of a periodized program to get you to that point. And that's where coaches might need a little bit more input to say, hey, this advice that we're seeing based on a 3-week study might be inappropriately applied in the general setting.
And if somebody is new to sprinting or resistance training, we never start that way. I mean, think about just nailing proper hinge technique for most people is going to take a while. So the idea that you can just jump to doing your 5-rep max it's just not going to happen, at least not safely, not in a way that any coach would ever condone.
Right. Yeah. And I think it's the same phenomena as when CrossFit became really popular. People were jumping into this and therapists loved it. And therapists love the same message now, is that they're seeing all the overuse injuries and the back injuries in CrossFit when it came out. But folks like me who are doing consults see every week, I damaged my quad, I tore my hamstring, I've got an adductor pull. What were you doing? I was sprinting. And what was your history before that? No, I didn't. Yeah, I think we could go on. Let's round off the discussion about talking nutrition in relation to exercise. And from an endurance background myself, fasted training has been used forever to promote fuel differences, to promote a greater use of fat at all intensities and a less use of muscle glycogen. And very good endurance athletes have used this as a foundational part in their preseason. And I know I've done a 4-hour ride on water. I know other people who've gone over 6 hours. Exceptional fat burning capacity. Not that we're saying that everyone needs to do this, but in other words, it's been used for a long time for a specific purpose. In the fitness industry, there's a misunderstanding that if you train before breakfast, you're going to burn a whole lot more fat and therefore lose more body fat. And I think a lot of scientists have stepped in to say burning fat's not the same thing as losing fat. And I think most people hopefully get that message. But recently, to come back to cortisol, there has been advice, and I've heard even recently, that females need to eat even before they go for a walk, because their body will spike cortisol differently to men, and therefore they will lose muscle mass. So they'll do some exercise, but actually lose muscle mass. And I just find this a simply astonishing claim. Where do you sit with this idea of exercising for a female, but having to eat beforehand to stop? I just didn't think females were that fragile, but you are a female. Tell me your take on this.
I think this is combining information from unhealthy individuals. It's a combination of the chronically elevated cortisol or no cortisol, and also people who are experiencing relative energy deficiency in sport. And that if you are really legitimately underfueling your performance, then we can see down-regulated muscle protein synthesis. You are at risk for things like bone fractures in that clinical population. So I think what has happened here is that people are taking from those two camps and combining this narrative that results in all of this fear-mongering around fasted training. And when we look at cortisol, it's supposed to be higher in the morning and it's supposed to be lower in the evening. It's supposed to increase with prolonged fasting. It's supposed to increase with exercise. And none of this is a problem that we need to fix. Our body regulates it really well in healthy individuals without us ever needing to think about it. So the idea that the cortisol spike would promote body fat accumulation, I think, comes from the experiences of unhealthy people with chronically high cortisol who have some body fat redistribution that can happen. And I think the narrative around muscle loss is coming from people who are chronically underfueling their training, either with a diagnosed eating disorder or in some version of red S where you're doing a lot of training volume and you're under fueling. And over time, that can have a downstream effect that it is serious. It can be a problem. But neither of these are common for the average person. And so we need to be really careful about this, as I said, fear-based messaging around fasting. The reality is when we look at long-term changes in body fat and lean mass with fasted and fed training, we don't see a difference. Some people like to train early in the morning. Some people feel better when they eat. Some people get GI disturbances when they eat close to training, so they prefer to train fasted. This should really be up to the individual and based on preference, because as long as you are consuming adequate calories and adequate protein throughout the day, all of these distinctions around nutrient timing are not important. And again, they're adding that level of complexity and confusion unnecessarily.
That sounds pretty sensible. And when we think about advice that we want to give the public, we want it to be sensible and not fear-mongering. And I think we also forget, if an individual is concerned about their cortisol, we know that exercise improves stress resilience. So you become better at tolerating cognitive stress, psychological stress by exercising. And it's also a physical outlet. This idea that exercise is going to contribute to more cortisol is just not there, unless we do need to have a conversation that you wake up and under the guise of fasted training and performance, it's actually an eating disorder. So you'll train, you will then wait until lunch because you're time restricted eating, and then have 200, and then you've got red air. So that's a conversation, but that's not what we're talking about for the average person who wants to train before breakfast, but they have to have protein beforehand. Otherwise, their muscles will implode.
Also, muscle loss just doesn't occur over an hour-long period. It's just not the way that it works.
Right.
So when you resistance train, that's the impetus for building muscle. And you can do that at high loads, low loads, moderate loads, but that is not going to result in muscle loss, whether you're fasted or fed.
Yeah, that's a great message. Is there anything else as we finish for today that you're very active in the space in social media, bringing science to the public of what data has shown, especially for females? I know that there's collagen being added to protein powders, there's various supplements. Is there anything that you think is really important that females have been told one thing, but that's actually quite in contrast to what scientists understand?
I think an overemphasis on supplementation is a big problem right now. That's the history of the fitness industry in general, but it's definitely, I'm hearing more and more peri and postmenopausal women say, do I need magnesium? Do I need creatine? Should I be using collagen? It's such an overemphasis on the small potatoes once again. So we really need to focus on doing challenging training, progressing over time, being consistent with it, and then having a healthy diet with adequate protein that fuels your performance. And that's the crux of the conversation. And anything beyond that, could creatine be helpful for improving your performance? Maybe, but the increase is going to be moderate. It's not changing your life. Is it good for bone health or brain health? The evidence isn't there yet. So I think the overemphasis on supplements, which is promoted by a lot of these influencers, is adding again to that confusion because we're not focusing on the things that are meaningful.
Right. The way that I would always explain it to my clients is that exercise is the 99.99% of everything that you want. And of course, exercise and your fueling and your nutrition, we'll put that together. Anything else, whether it's a recovery strategy, whether it's a supplement, it's so small that if we gave you placebo versus it, you're not going to know. And it's not going to show up in a DEXA scan. So let's really focus on getting right those things. And again, it's sensible. It's not sexy. It doesn't sell a book, but that's just the reality of it.
And I think if you're a coach and people are coming to you with these questions, or if you're just someone who's reading all of this online and thinking, I'm so confused because I'm a woman, do I need to do everything differently?
Yeah. Yeah.
When we think about smart programming and good coaching, there will always be a level of individualization at play. Because again, we should do something that's conducive to meeting your goals in your time frame in a way that is sustainable for you. So individualization is key. But there's no reason why we need to approach that differently just because you are a biological man or woman. That is just smart programming and good coaching.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think that's why great sports scientists like you have come from a coaching background or an athletic background, because you understand that it's a journey and an experience and a process, and you can ask the right questions of research to get those kinds of answers. Let's summarize today. I'm going to just list a few points that we've discussed, and if you'll just give a one-sentence summary. Training differently across the menstrual cycle due to hormones.
Unnecessary. If you do have menstrual symptoms, feel free to take a day off or adjust your session. Otherwise, don't worry about it.
Perfect. Having protein immediately after a training session because you are female.
Unnecessary. As long as you're consuming sufficient protein throughout the day, you're good to go.
Dropping or greatly reducing your moderate intensity zone 2 exercise in favor of sprinting and HIIT training.
This should really be tailored to your preference, your performance goals, and what you can adhere to long term. Both are equally effective for changes in body composition and overall health.
Perfect. Are there unique resistance training guidelines for females, especially peri-postmenopause?
No.
And finally, should females avoid faster state training because of a potential loss in muscle and spike in cortisol?
Nope. Do whichever you prefer.
Lauren, the industry owes you a enormous debt for doing the really hard research, but also very patiently dealing with the same questions over and over every day, which are what we've discussed today. Should females, because they are confused, and you are providing great coaching and scientific answers to that. Where can people find more about you, and what are you currently working on?
You can find me on Instagram at Dr. Lauren CS1. I'm also a contributor to the Mass Research Review. So if you're someone who wants a really deep, unbiased dive into some of the latest science, I do that along with Eric Helms, Eric Trexler, and Mike Sordos.
Fantastic. Lauren, thank you for your time today. And I hope we have part 2 down the track to see what new research has come out and whether we have a change in thinking or whether we expand our opinions on all of these amazing topics. So thanks for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for tuning in. I hope you found today's episode as valuable as I did. If you're interested in going deeper into the science of how women respond to training and how to actually apply that in the real world, I'd love to invite you to join me for the Science of Thriving. It's a 9-week course I've created for both coaches and individuals, combining the latest science and research with lessons from over 30 years of coaching. You can head to the Science of Thriving to learn more and sign up. Thanks again, and I'll catch you next week in the next episode.